housekeeping. Shoulder is posted on move. Did we confirm that? Yep, we're good. Okay, so shoulder muscle is posted on move. Just as a reminder, I mean, those are black and white, so feel free to utilize other books or Google and look at other pictures. And so although that's just a reference, it doesn't have to be your only reference. Okay, you can utilize as much as you want. Also, again, as a reminder, we're just going over major muscles as pertaining to motion, flexors, extensions, adductors, adductors. But again, man, secondary functional muscles as stabilizers, I just need to re-emphasize that enough, how important muscles are, not just to move you, but to keep your bits and pieces together. So, last class we did, please don't be like that today. Last class we did latissimus dorsi, right? We did the lat, we did deltoid, we did senior deltoid. Did we do any other? We just did those two? Okay. All right, so let's cruise on. Let's start with a big time country muscle called the pectoralis major. Because the pectoralis major and the lat, and again, this is what I love about function and crossings, that at first you look at them and you say, well, they live in two totally different areas, they must do two totally different things. And you'd be surprised how much they have in common at the shoulder. So pec, anterior muscle, lat, posterior muscle, but they cross very similarly in two different dimensions, in two different planes. So the pectoralis major is talked about, first what's a fan-shaped muscle, so we can have sections that all have something in common, but yet one section has a different line of pull than another section. Traditionally, these two different parts are discussed as either lower or upper. Biomechanist friends of mine don't particularly care for lower because lower insinuates an opposite pole as the upper. So in other words, if you say the uppers are shoulder flexors because they pull up, that insinuates the lowers are shoulder extensors. So they don't particularly kind of like that verbiage. They prefer more sternal fibers, clavicular fibers, in terms of the sections. Now you may look at it and you say, well, there is kind of lower fibers, and yeah, that's true. But the lower fibers, in terms of the pec, aren't pulling back. They don't cross to be able to pull in the direction of extension. And in fact, the rope that they're pulling on, even though you have kind of lower fibers there, when they blend in to the rope, and the rope kind of cuts across, and that's actually what's tugging on the humerus, okay? So you're looking at origins that kind of have some sternal starts and some clavicular starts, okay? And then the insertion, we're looking at the link between two majors, this big long strip, pectoralis major. So in terms of direction of pull, it should make sense that in anatomical position, that muscle is trying to pull your humerus into your thorax, right? So an adductor, a shoulder adductor. And because it's pulling, you know, this little strip is kind of more on the lateral side. So technically, if this muscle shortens, it would want to line up like this, right? So in anatomical position, a big time internal rotator. The lat was an internal rotator. Yeah, you got some big, powerful internal rotators. And again, we talked about why. When you're trying to speed up your hand to throw, not just a baseball, but a rock, or a sling, or a spear, right? You need some engine to speed that thing up. So latissimus dorsi, pec major, big, powerful internal rotators working on the same team. And again, what's cool is that they're still working on the same team, yet one of them's in the front, one of them's in the back. Because it's not about living in the front, living in the back. It's how you cross that joint in order to cause spin. All right, is your ant okay? Yes, your ant's okay. Okay, good. That's what matters. The aunt is okay. I give her my best. So, big, powerful internal rotators. Another thing that's really cool too is this concept. Again, I'm trying to work in what I think is some interesting stuff just to kind of keep you guys awake. Watch. This is going to be great. Okay. Ooh, that's good. So, we've all seen this before, maybe not to this extreme, but powerlifters, bodylifters arch their back. So, mechanically, we look at, well, some different reasons why. And yeah, well, you don't have to do as much leg work, that's true. But you basically create, because even though your shoulders are moving the same globally, they're not moving the same locally. So my point is that when you reposition the trunk, don't look at the lower half. Don't look at his pelvis. Just look at the thorax. Basically, what your shoulders are doing are adducting, a component of horizontal adduction and adduction. You see that there? It's not just pure horizontal adduction. You have an element of regular adduction too. Well, guess what's a big, powerful adductor? Your lats and your legs. So it's a way to reposition your body where you get the biggest, most powerful muscles to help influence your motion. So the point is that when these lifters arc their back, it's a way to get the trunk in a position where your lat can contribute to the function. And anytime you can get the lat to help, that's a good thing. Because it's a horse. Okay? Do not hurt yourself, but you can go try to do this. All right. So back to pectoralis major. You do have a muscle called pectoralis minor that functions at your scapula that I'm going to lecture on. So I want to preference when we say pecs, we have to make sure we're clear on what we're talking about. Okay. So pecs could be majors and minors. Pecs could be my right and left pectoralis major, right? So we just have to make sure we're clarifying what we're talking about. All right. Other functions of the pectoralis major. All of the fibers. So remember when we lectured on deltoid, and I said when all of the fibers are working for the same function, you don't have to be redundant. In other words, if I'm doing like side raises, and all of the fibers of that deltoid is helping, I don't have to be redundant and say deltoid, anterior, posterior, middle. By saying deltoid and ending it, I'm inferring all of the different fibers, okay? Right? Very similar with pectoralis major. When we say pectoralis major and end it, that's what does all the fibers do? And in anatomical position, all the fibers pull down and they spin in. So in other words, you don't have to be redundant and say pectoralis major, sternal, and clavicular. Right? Now, those clavicular fibers have more of obliquity to them, angle. Remember obliquity is angles? And so in addition to have the horizontal pull, now they have a vertical pull. So the clavicular fibers can actually pull anteriorly, crossing the shoulder in the front, to assist in the pull of direction of shoulder flexion. So that's why upper pec is what's called a lot, but the clavicular fibers can be shoulder flexors, pulling in the direction of shoulder flexion. Now, your circle, we have a problem. There's always a solution to the problem. But most muscles fit nice and comfortably in the circle, but there are a couple with the fan shapes that get a little tricky, okay? I normally don't like to go redundant. I normally don't like to repeat myself on circles, but in this case I had to. So what I mean by that is you see on your circle the PM, I think it's PM, right? Pectoralis major. So that is basically saying all of the fibers of the pectoralis major cross medially in anatomical position, pulling in the direction of adduction, making them adductors. All of those fibers are trying to spin medially, pulling in the direction of internal rotation, making all of the fibers in anatomical position internal rotators. However, only the clavicular fibers have the vertical pull to pull in the direction of shoulder flexion. So how in the world can you communicate that one section when all the fibers do two things? And that's to literally write pectoralis major clavicular fibers in its own little box on the anterior posterior axis. Now, if it helps you, like we did with the deltoid where you connected, remember how I said that you could connect those dots to remind you that it's one muscle? You could totally draw like a little dotted line or a little line reminding you that that's the same muscle. However, technically we are going redundant because the clavicular fibers are part of the pectoralis major. So don't think of it as that pectoralis major without the clavicular fibers. That pectoralis major has it in it, but oh, by the way, only these fibers do this one function. Make sense? All right, now, the pectoralis major is a functional changing muscle. It can switch its function based on your shoulder position, and I'll explain why. I didn't make the rules, it just follows the rules of mechanics. But remember in 310 where I taught you how if you learn to add an adduction from away from the midline and towards the midline, that can sometimes trick you when you're doing the shoulder, because the shoulder, you go and it comes back to the midline. And so it's common for students to be like, add, because they're like away and then towards. But in mechanics, it's still adduction. It's about direction of spin, right? However, from the muscle's perspective, if you think about it, the pectoralis major is just trying to pull humerus, to the thorax. So if you're below 90 degrees in the frontal plane, that means get over here. But if you're past 90 degrees in the frontal plane, that means get over here. Does that make sense? Meaning that the pectoralis major, when you're at 90 degrees, it runs like this. Below 90, it wants to shorten comme ça. Past 90, because of some external rotation that I taught you happens in 310, the pectoralis major wants to pull like this. Come here, comme ça. And of course the pectoralis major wants to pull like this. We're going to get into horizontal adduction a little bit. We're just talking frontal plane. Below 90, adductor. Past 90, abductor. So on all of those shoulder presses where you feel like an animal, you feel extra strong, it's because you get some pec major helping pulling the shoulder to the thorax. Here's another, for those of you that have some dabble in gymnastics and tumbling. Y'all know what an iron cross is? It's a move done on the rings. Let's see. This, if you look at this, it might make your pec rip out. Oh my God, no, not that kind of cross, guys. Very interesting. No mas. This is not easy to do, right? My God, that kid is more athletic at 8 than I'll ever be in my life. All right, let's take a look. So one of the reasons that, ready, go. Ready, go. Okay. One of the reasons it's so hard to do a perpendicular iron cross, so they get scored based on how much they can go parallel, is because the more you go parallel, the more you lose your pectoralis major as an adductor, prevent your arms from adducting. So in other words, if you get it here, yes, there's some mechanicals involved where your hands are further away and that's harder, but you also lose that pectoralis major. So you could just imagine how much easier it would be down here where your pec can prevent your arm from going up. But once you get to 90 and the pec only pulls across, you lose it as a functioning muscle. It makes it a lot tougher. Okay? So the pectoralis major, now This is where I'm going to test your knowledge, your practical knowledge of what we've been talking about. Why? Because the pec can be an adductor or abductor, depending on your position, right? Why do we have it listed as an adductor in your circles? Anatomical position. So in other words, I'm going to teach you directions of pull here, and then teach you, oh, when I get out of here, it can also pull that. Okay? So that's why it's listed as an adductor in your circles, because everything's based off of anatomical position. Okay? So, pectoralis major in anatomical, adductor, internal rotator, the clavicular fibers pull in the direction of shoulder flexion. You go past 90, it can be an abductor. All right. Let's talk about the trunk's transverse plane. We'll get into that. We'll do that in a second. We'll talk, once I get you to all the muscles, then we'll talk about horizontal AB and AEs. All right, let's keep moving. Let's see, let me do all the country muscles. So, you have a sister, did I teach y'all about sister muscles yet? Or did I introduce the term sister muscle? So basically a sister muscle is a term that we use in mechanics to talk about a separate innervated muscle that has the exact same function at a given joint. Okay? So the teres major, some of you may have heard when you talk about rotator cuffs, teres minor. Well, the teres minor has a big brother, big sister called the teres major. And that teres major is a shoulder functioning muscle that has the same exact line of pull as the latissimus dorsi at the shoulder. It doesn't go off and do all the other stuff lat does in other places in the body. But in terms of the glenohumeral joint, it has the exact same function. Not because of origin. Insertion is very close, but it's crossed. It has the same cross. So remember, lady between two majors, latissimus dorsi, pec major, here's the teres major, comes from the scapula to the humerus, crosses in the front, so its spin is going to be internal rotation, just like a latissimus dorsi. Its frontal plane pull is going to be adduction. When I say adduction, I'm not talking about literal motion, I'm talking about pulling in the direction of adduction. Right? Internal rotation, adduction, and then because the scapula is more posterior than the humerus, it's going to want to pull in the direction of extension. So if you look at your circle, those two muscles live in the same quadrant. They're both posteromedial muscles. So the posterior part pulling in the direction of extension, the medial part pulling in the direction of adduction, and then the spin circle pulling in the direction of internal rotation. So my point is that teres major and lat, you should not miss those because they have the exact same functions at the shoulder. At the shoulder. Let me make sure we get through all of our big country muscles, and then I'll get into some city living muscles. Here's another picture of the pec major. Notice how all these posterior inserting muscles, you can kind of see the blend in, but this teres major, nope, because it's going from the back to the front. All right, let's get into some city muscles. All right, biceps brachii, or brachii, potato potato. So the biceps, in lexicon, we just think about elbow stuff, but the bicep functions at the shoulder, although it's a weaker function, it's not one of your powerhouses of the shoulder. But it does have an important function in the shoulder, especially for stability, man. Again, you think about carrying heavy things, you gotta have something preventing your humerus from just falling out. You know? And so you imagine that biceps brachii, and in terms of where it's coming from, there's these two little red dots. One is on this coracoid process, you learned that from anatomy, this little bump. This coracoid is part of your scapula. It's not a separate bone, it's just an area of a bone. It's like the panhandle of Florida. The state is Florida, you got a little prominences all over the place. And the reason this little thing jets out is to have a better mechanical pull. Its angles of pull and pulleys, and so bones can serve as pulleys as well. So you have this biceps brachii, what they call a short head and then a long head. I mentioned this maybe last week, that long and short isn't about the muscle, it's about the tendon, right? Longs and shorts. So that long head kind of has more of a tendon that kind of spirals around. For those of you that know what bicipital grooves are, your long head is the one that goes in between the bicipital grooves, which, cool fact, the bicipital groove is actually made up of the in-between of the two areas where your rotator cuff muscles are tugging on. So they're tugging on those things, and over time, it increases the bony prominence, Wolff's Law, and specific adaptations to the postman. So you got some rotator cuff muscles pulling over the linea here and here, and over time, it kind of creates this natural groove where that biceps tendon falls in. So the fact that it has its own groove should kind of emphasize its role in stability, okay? Now, in terms of function, I'm going to give you kind of the layman's function, but then we're going to talk about some cool stuff. Okay? Layman's terms function, biceps brachii, long and short head here, long head right there. Both pull in the direction of shoulder flexion because they both have an anterior crossing. However, that long head is anterolateral, meaning that some of it is in front, but some of it's on the outside. So the lateral crossing will also pull in the direction of abduction. In terms of a stabilizer, you can understand having an extra rope right there is going to kind of keep that head from popping out. But in terms of direction of motion, you're looking at the short head being of this, and the long head being of this, where there's a component of both of these things, and then together you get motion. That's the stuff you're going to be accountable for. The cool stuff is that midway muscle. And this is where people get into problems because of the biceps role as a midway muscle. What I mean by that is you look at that muscle straight up and down, kind of like a rectus. And if you say, well, what would happen if I internally rotate? You would spiral that muscle around the humerus, and it would want to pull you back to anatomy. And if you externally rotate, you would spiral it around the other way, and it would want to pull you to anatomy. So where throwers would get into problems is when it comes time to slow down internal rotation. Remember, you have all these big, meaty, powerful internal rotators, and then you only got kind of a couple little slower downs. The bicep can be a big, slower muscle if it's being lengthened in its transverse plane. And so for my athletic trainers or people that are in the clinics, you hear things called labrum tears or tears of your labrum. That's your biceps. Because your bicep here, when you spiral it too much and it pulls off a little piece of that suction cup, that's what's pulling off the suction cup. And when you, as you know, if you pop open a suction cup and pressure, so when you pull off that labrum and you have leaking and all of a sudden you don't have the negative pressure to hold it bad. Okay? Now, why do these things happen? Man, why ask why? What's cool though is that a lot of times it's because of oopsies. Most injuries are caused because of oopsies. What I mean by that is when you're tired, when you're fatigued, especially in the little leagues levels, Andrew's and them showing research on this. Adult levels too, but think about it. At least adults have had years of innovation and kind of getting conditioned to do this. It's about fatigue. When you're tired, you make mistakes. When you're tired, you don't function normally. When you're tired, a muscle group that was supposed to turn on to do a job may be a little bit late. So that kind of helps explain why somebody can make a cut thousands of times and then on the 5,000th time, something goes wrong. Because there was a muscle group that was supposed to turn on at a certain amount of time, and because you were tired, because your body wasn't reacting the way it would, it made a mistake. Something turned on too soon, something turned on too late, something didn't turn on at all. And remember, muscles aren't just there for mobility, they're there for stability. So if that group didn't turn on to slow you down or to stabilize, you can have improvements. Okay. So for the test, I'm just going to have you know the functions on the circle, because that gets kind of some crazy stuff. I just wanted to introduce you to the fact that the biceps brachii can spiral around and function in both ways as a midway muscle. But that's more for just some cool FYI stuff. Biceps brachii short head has a sister muscle called the coracobrachialis. I know that's a lot of syllables, but it's real easy. Coracoid process to the brachial part of the arm. Straight, straight down. And it's a sister muscle to the biceps brachii short head at the shoulder. Notice it doesn't mean it has the same function everywhere. It doesn't go down and function at the elbow, radial joint. But at the shoulder, they have the exact same function. Coracobrachialis and biceps brachii short head. All right. Let's talk about rotator cuff. Dr. Bob McClendon, who was my mentor, he's an orthopedic when I was doing a athletic training fellowship at Auburn. He worked for the Houston Clinic. And just to kind of give you a little background, the Houston Clinic is where Dr. James Andrews actually started in Columbus, Georgia. And the story, I actually heard old Dr. Jack Houston tell the story. He said back in the 70s and stuff, like the shoulder was like taboo, like nobody wanted to mess with it because it was complex. We didn't have all the research. But Andrews was like, great. So that's how he kind of developed trial and error, because nobody wanted to touch shoulder stuff because it was, they didn't know, but Andrews was like, bring it to it. So at the Houston Clinic, Dr. Bob, who was our orthopedic mentor, would say over and over again, he'd say the rotator cuff muscles are just kind of the keepers of the shoulder. They're like, they're the communicators to everyone involved. Country muscles, city muscles, they're the ones that are communicating to everybody what's going on. Their function is really, really cool. Of course, they're going to have some motion function. But at the end of the day, remember how I taught you about canceling out motion? Like if I have a left and a right sterno and I want to pull forward, the right wants to spin me to the left and the left wants to spin me to the right, and they can cancel that out to pull together. That's how I want you to consider these rotator cuff muscles. You have one on the inside that by itself wants to spin you this way. Then you have a couple on the outside that by themselves want to spin you that way. So when they're working together, they cancel out each other's spin. They can draw, translate, stabilize, basically keep the golf ball on the golf tee, as Dr. Bob used to say. There are trade-offs in life. There's trade-offs in function. There's trade-offs in biomechanics. What we gain in stability, we lose in mobility, vice versa. Y'all heard me say that several times. The hip doesn't need a rotator cuff group because the hip has a huge socket, the hip has an extra ligament, the hip has very tight muscles, and you don't get the motion in the hip because of those things. You don't have to worry about things sliding out of place. But not the shoulder. The shoulder, we sacrifice stability so that we can throw and move and reposition our hands. All that extra motion for function comes at a price. It comes at a gamble. And that gamble is that the more we allow it to move, the greater the chance that something can mismove. Okay? So one of the ways we try to have some redundancy in our stability is literally that rotator cuff. The rotator cuff serves as a muscular socket. Just another way to look at it. Okay? Dr. Bob used to call them the keepers of the shoulder because if you bruised your rotator cuff, it didn't matter if your deltoids would work and everything else is functioning. The role of that rotator cuff to maintain order, to maintain that golf ball and that golf tee superseded those other muscles that were trying to move you around. So in other words, if you had a bruised rotator cuff muscle, you couldn't even move your arm, even though your other country muscles were fine. Okay? So the first thing I want to say is that we're going to have, you talk about cliches, cover your bases, right? You want to have all your bases covered. Well, in baseball, lucky for us, we got 4 bases. Technically, Campbell 3 bases and a plate. I get it. But we want to cover all of our bases. And we're going to talk about 4 bases to cover 4 rotator cuffs. Now, some people like to think outside the box and they say, that bicep technically is a 5th rotator cuff muscle because it helps to stabilize. All I'm talking about is the ones that are actually encapsulating on the humeral head itself. That's what I'm including. I'm not disrespecting the role of bicep, but I'm just saying literally the muscles that are tugging on the golf ball itself to keep it inferior. And okay. So the first one we're going to talk about is covering our front base, first base, and that is our subscapularis. And again, guys, a lot of these muscles are very easy to learn because of the suggestive nature of their names. Subscapularis. Where does a submarine live? Under the water. Where does the subscapularis live? Under the scapula. It's really that easy. So remember in 310 I taught you that the scapula as a joint is not really a joint. Scapulothoracic articulation, because it kind of floats back there, held together with negative pressure in muscles. So I like to look at it as if this was a piece of meat. If this was a slice of bread, and you have some deli meat that's literally on the inside of the bread. So you see all of that red stuff on the inside? That's where the meat is. That's where the subscapularis is. So it starts underneath the scapula and it comes up here and it's actually pulling on one of the little bony prominences that make up that bicipital groove. Now, by itself, it wants to do this. Pulling in the direction of internal rotation. Makes it an internal rotator. Okay? Now, another important thing to note here, guys, is that all of our adductors pull more on like the shaft or the neck of the bone. These rotator cuff muscles are actually pulling on the ball itself. So in other words, they're kind of on the axis, AP and bilateral, but they're not on the axis from the polar. On the polar, they can spin the merry-go-round. But the translatory effect of literally pulling on that humerus, on the head of the humerus specifically, and saying, stay here. Stay. Don't go too far up, don't go too far down, don't go too far out. Here. Okay? Subscapularis. Now, first baseman, typically, now there's not exceptions, but like I'm a Mets fan, right? So we have a first baseman, his name's Pete Alonso. This dude is like the size of a rhinoceros. He's like 6'5", 240, big guy. A lot of first basemen are big guys. Subscapularis is a big, strong, we call it tonic, very prone to tightness, very, very, very tense muscle. So my point is that when I talk about the 2 muscles that are pulling double plate duty in the back, it's okay that you got 2 in the back and 1 in the front, if the 1 in the front is just as strong as the 2 in the back. Does that make sense? Okay? So our double plate combination on the posterior, right, back here, we have our spine of the scapula as a bony landmark. Above it, we're going to talk about the supraspinatus, but below it, right now, we're going to talk about our double plate combo in the back, the infra, below the spinatus. And the teres major's little brother, sister, the teres minor. So these 2 muscles, you see these little 2 dots right there on the humeral head? They do like this. They don't pull in the direction of internal rotation, they pull in the direction of external, lateral rotation. However, when the 2 in the back work with the 1 in the front, they are translating that humeral head. They are keeping that humerus on the socket. You don't have an extra ligament in there like you do with the hip. You don't have a big fat socket like you do with the hip. You got a little socket And it's still a socket, by the way. So some people will be like, technically it's not a bullet socket. It's still a socket, it's just not much of a socket. It's still there. But it's more like a T on a golf ball. And you know that a golf ball can blow off with just a little bit of... So, although we want to allow a lot of motion, we have to have some mechanism in place at least to try to police a little bit. Muscles. Okay? But again, when you're tired, when you're fatigued, when your body may not be functioning normally, and those muscles were supposed to kick on and they're a little bit late, sometimes things can happen. Okay? All right, covering the final base. This one covers the top. It's called the supraspinatus. This is the muscle that's most commonly with impingement syndrome. Anybody ever heard that? I'm going to talk about it a little bit. The cool thing about the supraspinatus is that it's actually not involved in any spinny things. It crosses lateral, pulling in a direction of abduction, but it's still serving to pull the humeral head, to keep the humeral head into the socket. So in other words, you got this, and this, all drawing the humeral head in. The one anterior obviously wants to spin this way. The one posterior obviously wants to spin that way. Okay? Now, a couple cool things that I think is cool. The biceps brachii long head and the supraspinatus are a continuation of each other. Meaning that the supraspinatus crosses the shoulder laterally and ends here. The biceps starts early and then continues on way down there. One of the reasons you get biceps tendonitis is because the bicep is working harder as an abductor when the supraspinatus is not feeling well. I'll give you some reasons why it may not be feeling well. In the hip, did I teach you guys what a force, I might have hinted at this in 310, but a reminder, what a force couple is. A force couple are two different linear forces that are working together to try to spin something. So you have a merry-go-round, and kids on the merry-go-round, you're not going to probably get on the same side of spin. If there's two people, you're going to say, hey, get on the other side. I'm going to push this way, you push that way, and we're going to spin it the same way. That's a force couple. And you have force couples all over your body. Sometimes this muscle works with that muscle. They're pulling in two different directions to try to spin your pelvis. Okay. Force couples that occur at the shoulder joint are as such. I have muscles that are trying to do this. I have muscles that are trying to do this. The socket, I'm going to give you the hip example first. The socket, if the socket wasn't there and the muscles just pulled, so how do you get the partial rotation going? Well, as the muscles are trying to do this, the socket pushes down on the head to create a force couple. Muscles are pulling out, the bone of the socket is pushing down, and you get general motion. Guys, there's no top part of the socket in the shoulder. So my point is, when you use these muscles like the deltoid, the pec, to raise your arm up, one of two things are going to happen. Your rotator cuff muscles are going to have enough strength to pull down on the head instead of pushing down like our hip socket does. And you get your force couple strictly from muscles. But if the rotator can't pull down enough, or if it's phasic, if it's weak, what's going to happen is that humeral head is going to translate up until the acromion pushes down. Something's going to keep that humeral head from shifting up. And if it's your acromion, if it's your bone, well, guess what? We just talked about a muscle that lives in between those two circles. The supraspinatus lives here. So if you're relying on your acromion to push down on your humeral head, guess what you're pinching off of, or guess what you're pushing on? You're pinching on muscle, you're pushing on muscle. Dr. Bob used to use this analogy. used to say, if you take a paper clip and bend it a couple times, you can still use the paper clip, but if you bend it enough times, if you take a piece of paper and you pinch it and you move it a little bit, but over the course of time, it's going to weaken and it's going to tear. So the point is that people that do overhead work, people that do overhead sports, if those rotator cuff muscles aren't able to do their job as a force couple, the bone itself is going to do its job for it. And over time, it may not be the first pinch, the 100th pinch, the 1,000th pinch, but eventually that muscle is going to get ticked off. Another way Dr. Bob used to give it, let me go with John, since John's from Delaware. That doesn't hurt, but let me do this for an hour. Eventually you're going to have a bruise. So when did that bruise, when was it created? Was it on the 5th poke, the 100th poke, the 1,000th poke? It's an example of cumulative trauma. That it's not necessarily the 1st, the 2nd, the 5th, but if you keep doing it, eventually your body has to communicate that it doesn't like what you're doing to it. That's what the inflammatory response is. That's like, whoa, dude, no. And this is secondarily, but it makes sense that if the biceps brachii is technically an insurance policy continuation of the supraspinatus, if this muscle's ticked off, guess who's going to work a little more as an abductor if you're not going to innervate? Guys, we don't innervate muscles that hurt, or it's hard for us. I'll give you an example of how pain can be a distractor. If someone has a bruise, like say on their thigh, and I ask them to put their arm out, I do a manual muscle test. Don't let me push you down, I'm very strong. And then I have them push me down, and then I press on that bruise. Going straight down. This pain is a distractor. So if it's hurting you to get your arms overhead because of the pain that supraspinatus is feeling, that muscle's going to shut off. And your biceps brachii long head, who has the same line of pull at the shoulder, anterolateral, is going to all of a sudden be working more than what it's used to. You can about imagine what could happen if you keep doing that work. It's going to start to get irritated. It's going to start to get ticked off. Biceps tendonitis. So a lot of times biceps tendonitis is usually secondary to supraspinatus impingement or supraspinatus tendonitis, or it could just be misdiagnosed where it's like I have pain here on the biceps, but it could be super. You have a lot of referred pain because there's a lot of wiring in here. Okay? But I just wanted to not overload you with stuff, but just to talk about some cool things about how these muscles aren't just working for movement, but working mechanically to keep that shoulder in position on the golf team. Okay? All right. So, check. Subscap, biceps, infra, teres. Look, there's a great picture of that supraspinatus. We extracted some of the spine up into the acromion so that you could see inside, but you could see how if you lifted your arm up and the humerus was able to translate up, it would pinch off and crunch up and not be a good day. Why? We talked about this last class. Why are rotator cuff exercises? I know they're boring. What's so needed is because you don't blood supply your rotator cuff. Because it's in the city, right? In other words, we can't allow our rotator cuff muscle to hypertrophy like we can these country muscles. We don't have the room for it. There's no room for it to grow. So because we limit its blood supply, it's prone to get weak. So you got to stay up with it. You gotta keep innervating it to keep it strong enough to do its job. Okay? Another thing y'all maybe you do, maybe you don't. But one of the reasons that in the therapy clinics and in athletic training rooms, we put like rolled up towels underneath the arm, right? One, you have to get that humeral head out a little bit, but it prevents you from doing secondary functions globally. What I mean by that is if you have someone doing some external rotator exercises, and they don't have that towel, they may say, well, get my hand out, so they may do stuff like this just to get their hand out, right? So how do you communicate? Yeah, I want you to get your hand out, but I want you to do this. They know what's inside here. They can't see the humerus doing that, right? So that towel in there helps to prevent them from abducting, because if you got to keep the towel under your arm, you're going to have more rotation and not have that secondary stuff that's unwanted. All right, the last muscle, I think, unless I missed one that I'm holding you accountable for, is the triceps brachii long head. At the shoulder, its only function is of an adductor, and I'll explain why it's not an extensor. It gets a lot of credit for being an extensor, because I think a lot of times when we do exercises, we feel it on, but we got to remember it's also on at the elbow, like creating a rigid link so that we can do these kind of exercises. So just because we feel it, it may not be because shoulder, it could be because of elbow. If you look at that son of a gun and where it actually, you see this little red part underneath the glenoid fossa right here? So in other words, if this muscle started on the spine, that would be different because it would pull it back. But it's literally on the axis itself. It's literally right underneath the socket. So its only pull is in, okay? So an anatomical position is just pulling you in. Again, if it would cross, let me give you a better view. Let's see. Use tricep, freak a tricep. Triceps brachii long head. That dapper little guy. So you see that is not in the back. That's literally underneath. There's a better view. It's literally underneath. That's underneath. So again, it would be different if it like started on the spine or something posterior, right? But it doesn't. And just because it inserts posterior doesn't mean it's crossing the shoulder posterior. It's just crossing the shoulder medially inside. Okay. So like I said, I think a lot of times when we feel triceps at shoulder stuff, it's because it's creating a rigid link. And the tricep is working to prevent flexion when we do like these kind of exercises. Okay, reminder, I'm going to come in early with working Wi-Fi and record a lecture. However, I will be more than happy to discuss or clarify any content you want to leave feedback sheets in the front for. So in other words, it could almost be like a Q&A. I'll be happy to go over anything, clarify anything, whether it's from a previous lecture, today's lecture. And if I have a lot of questions, that may be the whole lecture. It's just to clarify a bunch of stuff. But if you don't have a lot of questions, and I'm like, good, they're good, then I'll move on to scatter. Okay? So you have feedback sheets at the end. That's where you can ask me if you have any questions or clarifications. I can literally do an entire clarification video for you guys. All right? Remember, no class Friday, which is a blessing because they can have all the barricades up and everything. Oh, I didn't tell you all that?
No.
So I'm going to be out of state visiting Dr. Hodges, a friend of mine who's a sports chiropractor, and we're going to be collaborating on some stuff. And I know you'll get over it in time. I know you may go through like all the different phases of grief, sadness, rejection, anger, but no physical class on Friday. Check. Y'all have a safe break.